go ahead and, all right, there you go. Ian.
Awesome. Cool. So, hi everyone. My name is Ian Schoonover, and I've been a off and on again boot camp instructor since 2015. Traveled all over the world teaching people how to code, and am now back in my home state of Texas, and hopefully about to start my next job in the EdTech space. Most recently, I worked for Galvanize, which is they have a boot camp program called Hack Reactor, and I was also working as a front end engineer for a company, a data company called Analect. Okay, so this talk is about HTMX, what it is, why it's important, why you should care about it, and how to use it in your application. So we'll just build a little app together. We'll look at an app that I built and talk about it in detail. So I think some of you are probably familiar with Nest.js. Yep, getting a nod from Callie. So that's the kind of the stack that you're using over here, and that's cool. That's great because Nest is built on Express, if I'm not mistaken, and Express is a super lightweight JavaScript framework for the back end. Runs on Node.js runtime, and that's what I'll be using for the back end of this application. So let's zoom out a little bit and talk about HTMX. Basically, by the time you walk away from this hour, you'll know what HTMX is, you'll know why it's useful, and you'll know where to learn more about it and just how to build really basic websites with it. And then you can always expand on that knowledge through the documentation. So we're going to jump over to the documentation. This is htmx.org, and they've got great documentation, great references, great examples, talks, essays. If you search for HTMX on YouTube, you'll most likely see a bunch of Primevision videos. He's pretty big on it. He even has an interview with the guy that created HTMX, and they talk a lot about what some of the stuff we're going to talk about now. They also have a Discord server, so if you really want to get into it, you can get in there and talk about the things that you're building and see what everybody else is using. And if you have a specific stack that you use, like you're using Rust or Go or something like that on the back end, or I heard someone talking about Python, Django, then you can talk with folks in that community that are also using that stack. So HTMX builds on HTML. The whole concept is that back when dinosaurs were roaming the earth and the World Wide Web wasn't a thing yet, but we had internet and we were sharing, not we as in me, I wasn't born yet, but older folks were sharing documents around for like research and government stuff and maybe some high level businesses that had access to it. They had HTML, just these documents. I don't even think there was CSS at the time. And so just text on a page. And they had what was called hypermedia. And one part of hypermedia is the hypertext. That's the hypertext in HTML, hypertext markup language. And so within hypertext, there are the concept of controls. And there are two controls in HTML. There's the anchor tag, which we all know if you put something inside of it and you assign the href, which is a hyperreference, to some URL or some other page or to a fragment via an ID, then it will take you from where you are currently to either a different place on the same page or a different page or a different place on that page or a different website altogether or a different place on that website altogether. So essentially it's the thing that transports you around the web. So that's the GET request, and that is one control. The other control is the form. So if they started out with these links, these anchor tags, and they said, this is really great because now we can have like a table of contents and you can click on a link and it can take you over to this page and you can read about this research, whatever it is. And it was blowing everybody's minds. But then somebody was like, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could also edit this stuff by submitting some input? So then forms came along. Now forms are going to be matched up with your post request or with your post action. And so, or post methods rather. And so all the HTML supplies to us is get and post. Now, I say all as if it's not a super powerful thing, but that's what ran the web for the longest time. All websites were using just anchor tags and forms, and that's how you got around, and there was tons of stuff being displayed and shared with that. So it's actually really powerful. But because it didn't have some of the other features that we're used to with building modern web applications, libraries and frameworks like jQuery back in the day and now things like Vue and Angular and React have augmented the client, the browser, on the front end with JavaScript, the only language that you can run in the browser unless you're using like WebAssembly or whatever, but we won't get into that. And allowed us to do things like hijack a form and say, just kidding, this isn't a post request, this is actually a put or a patch or a delete. And now I'm getting full CRUD on my resources. And it doesn't even have to be a form, right? Like with JavaScript, you could do that with an anchor tag, or you could just have a button. You could say, this button deletes stuff. You can't do that by default with HTML. So in that way, we've used JavaScript to augment HTML, which is fine. JavaScript is really powerful. That wasn't its original intention, though. JavaScript initially was just supposed to be a client-side scripting language that added some interactivity and some cool stuff like that. But it is a powerful language and it's there, and so we've used it and we've created all these tools from it, which is great, and they work really well in a lot of cases. But as many of us know, in some other cases, they can be kind of overkill. So you're just like, man, I'm trying to build this really simple CRUD website, but everybody's telling me I should use the MERN stack or whatever stack, and suddenly I'm just like having to build components for everything, and there's just this like spider web of complexity for what should be really simple. But I'm doing that because I really don't want to build a monolithic application with a backend framework, MVC framework, MVT framework, like Django or Flask or Express.js or whatever it may be, Ruby on Rails, etc., because I don't want each page to just like refresh every time I go to a new page. It sends the whole entire page, and so we have to reload the whole thing. If you're scrolling and you're midway down the page and you click on a link, it takes you all the way back to the top because it loads a brand new page, unless you're using like an anchor tag that just takes you to a fragment. So that's one reason why we've shied away from that, and that's kind of like the old way of doing things. Not to mention some other patterns with scalability issues and whatnot, but I won't get into that for now. Okay, so what does HTMX offer us? And what it's doing is it is generalizing hypermedia in HTML such that we can augment HTML to now have access to everything that JavaScript gives us access to. Here's the kicker though. We don't have to write a line of JavaScript. Everything happens within HTML as HTML attributes. So if you want a button to send a delete request, no problem. You can do it. Just add an attribute, hx-delete is equal to whatever the URL you want to send the request to, and then a couple more attributes to indicate where what other elements get targeted or which event triggers it, and so on and so forth. So now all of a sudden you have access to all these things that would require quite a few lines of vanilla JavaScript, maybe a little bit less jQuery, and maybe a little bit less something like React if you're writing just like vanilla React and you're not using like an entire library. Um, Now we can do it all just with a couple lines of code, not even a couple lines, just a couple characters on top of our existing code. So let's go ahead and look at an example of that with an application. So over here, we have a simple to-do application that I built with Express.js. And we're using Express on the back end, so Node.js, JavaScript on the back end, and we're using EJS for the template language. So that's basically how we're getting the HTML on the page, is we're using this EJS template language to inject data into our templates, which we'll see here momentarily. So this is the home page, which the moment we go to the home page, it actually redirects us to the to-dos page. To-dos page is kind of a combination of what would be the new page and the index together. So we got our new form, we got our index. That's going to cause a slight issue that you'll see here in a little bit, but it's something that can be easily fixed. And so here we have all of our to-do items listed. These are just the default 3. I'm not actually hooked up to a persistence layer. I'm just using memory to store all this stuff inside of an array. I'm not doing like MongoDB or SQLite or anything like that. And so every time the server refreshes, it's going to delete and just start with these 3 default to-do items. You can see that each to-do item in this unordered list has an icon for editing and deleting. And if we want to create a new to-do, then we can just put it up here. And it immediately appends it or prepends it to the inside of the unordered list as a list item. And it has its own edit link and its own delete link as icons. Now, you will notice that I didn't reset my form because I just scaffolded all this together right before the class. So that's the one thing I didn't get to. But ignoring that, you can now edit or delete any one of these. So let's say we want to edit the 3rd item down. We just click edit, and immediately it swaps out our new form with the edit form. Now, typically, if we were doing this in a monolithic format, just with regular EJS templates, whenever you clicked on any one of these links, you would notice there's a little spinning wheel that says like, oh, we're loading the contents of the new page from the route that you sent the request to. That's not happening. So we've got this single page application sort of dynamic interaction occurring without any JavaScript, without us having written any JavaScript. So you click on edit on any one of these and it keeps updating this edit form with whatever to-do item that you clicked. And then you go up here and you can add some stuff to it. When you click update to-do, it swaps it back out with the new to-do form, which I guess I probably should just have the new to-do swap out with itself to clear it out. But anyway, and it updates this item down here all seamlessly. Likewise, if you want to delete any of these, you just click on the one you want to delete and it disappears. And because we're still on the same session for this process, I can refresh the page and that persists. Okay. So let's take a look at the code that makes all this possible. I can show you kind of just how powerful HTMX is. So it would have been nice if I had, the way I had written this, I had written the original application with the monolithic code and showed you that. You'll just have to imagine what that's like. But essentially just think anytime you make a change, typically like when you're first learning how to code, if you teach yourself through tutorials or you go to a boot camp, you create a CRUD application, create, read, update, delete. And you do that, you learn about REST. So you have your index and your new and your show and your edit and your update and your delete. And you don't do anything with a front end framework until first you learn the basics of like an MVC framework on the back end. And so every time you go to one of these pages, the show page or the index page or the new form or the edit form, it's always a brand new page. And unless you're using partials and then maybe you can combine some of them like we did here. But either way, you go to the new page, it's a whole new request. It loads it, kind of get like that blink of the new page loading. So just imagine that's what it would have been like previously. And now we have kind of this spa single page application type thing happening with HTMX. So let's look at the file structure first. I'm not going to assume that anybody's familiar with Express, so we'll just go through this. Express is really simple. You literally put everything into a single app.js file. And then as your application grows, you start moving things out into their own folders. So if you want to follow MVC, you have your models and your views and your controllers. This is a very simple application. So the only thing we have in terms of the MVC layers is going to be the view layer, which we put all of our templates, the views inside of a views directory. If you're coming from Django, then the term views is synonymous with the term templates in the MVT structure. App.js is where the meat and potatoes of the application is. And so at the very top, we just bring in all of our boilerplate, things like the Express framework itself. We initialize a new instance of Express, creating the app. We bring in things like paths, so we can use that down here with setting the directory for our views so it knows where to look anytime we try to render a view. And then we bring in EJSmate for our, this is going to be for like our layout. And then Morgan for HTTP logging. So as we're running the terminal with the application, we can see like if we go to the home page, it'll say, okay, you just sent a GET request and that returned a 200 response. And then we set our engine to EJSmate. We set our view engine to EJS, which just means that that's what we're using for our template language. Like I said before, we set up our views directory. Express URL encoded is just an integration of a tool called body parser. When you set it to extended true, all that does is make sure that when you submit a form, you can access all of the values from the form mapped to the name attributes and their values from the inputs in an object called rec.body, which we'll see here in a moment. So basically just giving us access to all the data from a form in our backend whenever the form is submitted. This is just the use of Morgan so that we can see those HTTP requests logged down inside of our terminal. And then I set a local variable called title to like the default title for every single page. You'll see that in our EJSmate layout here in a moment where we have like a variable for the title, just the title that you see at the browser tab. And if any one of the pages doesn't include a title, this will be its default. So then again, I said I didn't include a database layer, so no persistence other than using memory. And so we just assigned an array of to-dos, and then I have some dummy to-dos in here with objects. Each one has an ID that's unique, they're in order, and then the text that gets displayed on the screen. So we're going to use this for mutating this list, editing any one of these values, adding a new value to it, or deleting any of them. So then the home page route here, this is how the system works for routing. I've put everything into the app.js file. You could move this into its own routes file. You could map those routes to methods and controllers, but that's for a architecture of a much larger application. So simply put, we have get requests to a forward slash, and then that gives us access to the request and the response objects. And in this case, we're just redirecting to forward slash to-dos, so that takes us down to the route directly beneath it. So down here with to-dos, the first thing we're going to do is look at that to-dos list that we created up here inside the to-dos variable. Called it a list. It's called an array in JavaScript, but I've been writing a lot of Python lately. So list, array, synonymous. So we sort the items inside of there in descending order, and then we go ahead and render. And what this is doing here is it's looking down inside of a folder within the views directory. Because we told our application further up that views is our main views directory, we don't have to indicate that views is the folder that we're looking at for the rendering of a template. Rather, it just goes straight to that folder. And so we can see within views, there's a folder called to-dos where I've organized all of my to-do templates. And the one that it's rendering here specifically is the index.ejs. And so then the next argument is going to be the local variable. So if you're coming from like Django, we call them the context dictionary. So this is our context object with our local variables. So we're passing in to-dos. And like I said, we have that default title, but you can also override it with a local variable within the scope of this res.render second argument. So this one is going to be the to-dos index specifically. So that is the main loading of the first page that you see here. Now, we have a form, and when you send a get request to /to-dos/new, it
I'm
will
so sorry.
render.
Can we
Well,
see the to-do/index file, or is that going to
absolutely.
be everything?
No,
I just feel like
definitely.
I really need to see what all it encompasses. I'm assuming it's like bringing in a few other, okay, include new form, include, okay, that makes
Yep.
sense. I just wanted
Yep.
to make
Yep.
sure.
So yeah, let's break this down real quick. This is the index.ejs. It uses a layout called boilerplate, and that's why we don't have all of our typical doc type, HTML, head, body, all that stuff, because that's abstracted away into the boilerplate template. So if we go look at that, this is EJS mate in action. It allows us to just render in whatever is using that specific layout, this layout that we're looking at, it will be injected right here into the body. Likewise, the title gets set dynamically from a variable passed in from that local variables object.
Oh, nice.
So I've got a bunch of stuff in here. Let's talk about this real quick. Pico CSS is a super lightweight CSS library that just makes it to where I don't have to style anything. All this comes from by default, and I literally included like one class to say, hey, this is a container. Everything else it's just regular HTML syntax, and Pico said, hey, let's make it look a little bit better. And so it gives me some default fonts and colors and buttons and stuff like that. Really great if you're just trying to scaffold something and you don't have time to mess with like Tailwind or some custom CSS. The next thing is the material CSS or material symbols, whatever it's called, from material fonts, I think they call it, from Google. And that's just so that we could get these little icons. And then this is just some inline styling because I didn't actually include a style sheet. And so, or not inline, but an internal style sheet rather. And so it's literally just one class name here, just some things that are going to make these positioned just right and make them a certain thickness and make sure that they're outlines instead of being filled, stuff like that. So not super important. So then everything lives inside of a class called container, and that just makes sure that we have this nice styling with the centering of all the elements with a little bit of margin left and right. So then everything else gets rendered into the body. Down here, of course, we have to have HTMX. We're bringing it in with the CDN, Content Delivery Network link. You get this from the htmx.org website. However, if you're doing this in production, you would actually want to download that file and serve it from your own local CSS, or sorry, in this case, JavaScript. And so the next thing is just a little line that I threw in here that logs all the HTMX stuff so that I can debug it. And you just open up your dev terminal, dev tools inside of your browser, and you can see any type of issues that are happening and help you debug some of the HTMX stuff. So that gets taken away, or sorry, This debugging stuff gets taken away when you ship to production, and then this gets converted to a local JavaScript file. Okay, so then because we're using boilerplate over in index.ejs, we have our header, which is this h1. So let's just move this over here, move this over here. So there's our h1 right there, and then we have a section right here with a div for the form. I call it form because it's either going to be the new form by default or the edit form, and we're just going to we're going to hook into this ID here to be able to swap out those forms. So when I click edit here, it takes that same div and now it populates it with the HTML from a partial with EJS for the edit form, and it injects the data for the specific to-do item that I clicked the edit link for. And then
Is it weird? This reminds me of PHP.
Does it?
Yeah, this feels like when I learned PHP, but no.
Nice. Yeah, I can see that just a little bit. Yeah, and I'm actually a pretty big fan of PHP. Like I'm a fanboy of PHP, but I don't actually use it in practice. I'm just
Well,
like
you're a minority. I feel weird when I tell people I've used PHP before. They're like, why would you? But anyways, I'm interrupting you.
oh no, I have a video coming out for you and anyone else that's interested. Like tomorrow, I'll upload it. But it's an introduction to the Laravel framework, which is essentially like the Ruby on Rails for PHP.
Blah blah
And
blah.
Laravel. If you watch that video and you haven't already been introduced to Laravel, you'll look at it and be like, "Oh my God, where has this been my whole life?" Okay, so staying on track here, this little button right here just swaps out the new. Again, all this interactivity that you're seeing, you would think, yeah, you need a listener for this and that needs to do this and that. No, this is all HTMX. Um, I think I have like 2 lines of JavaScript, and that's just because I was too lazy to look up the documentation for the specific thing I need to do to use HTMX instead. Okay, so this is our form, lives inside this div. Right beneath it, we have our little index here with the to-dos list. Again, I'm putting an ID on here because I'm going to hook into this unordered list, and I'm going to replace, or rather, I'm going to prepend the newest, the whatever to-do items I add. So if I add one, I don't know why it says walk the dog. That's weird. Oh, now it came back. All right, so some weird bug. I think maybe it was something in the, let's try it again, now that we refreshed. Okay, there it is. That was weird. So hello world, here it is at the top, and that's because we hook into this and we drop it in at the top. Okay, so then we're using this include thing. The include is essentially, you'll see why it's important, but basically with EJS, we use this concept of partials. So if you're coming from React, then just think of like a component. We're just saying like, hey, I've got this separate snippet of HTML. I'm going to pass some properties down into it, or props if you're coming from React, and you're going to use that to kind of update the DOM with that snippet. But it's its own separate file. And this one is called new form, and this one's called to-dos list. And the to-dos list takes the actual to-dos. And so we'll get to that in a second after we go through the rest of the routes. So that is the rendering of the index, and that's what we're seeing here. Now, this is the to-dos new, to-do form. It's not currently being used actually until we do something like click on the edit, and then it gives us until we click the cancel, and then it gives us the new to do. So what the cancel button does is it sends a request to here, and the res.render says, okay, I've got a template called new form, and I'm going to give it a title, which is not super important. But if we go over to the new form, in fact, the title doesn't get used at all. If we go to the new form here, it is going to return this HTML as the response to the request from the cancel button. So this is the whole thing with HTMX, is like you can, sure, we could have done that with an anchor tag where you send a get request. So that part's not changed, but what has changed is that the HTML that's coming back is automatically getting updated on the page. So without any type of refreshing or loading a new page or anything like that, the HTML is just getting swapped out. Okay, so that's the big kicker here that I should point out in case I didn't make that clear before, is that traditionally, whether you're using vanilla JavaScript or jQuery or React or whatever, you would send like a fetch request when you need something, and the fetch request would send back JSON, and then you would parse the JSON, and then you would use that to populate a custom HTML element, a React component, whatever it is, and that would update the DOM. What we're doing here is we are just sending HTML and we are sending data from like a form, or we are sending just a request with a body and or query parameters. And then what's getting returned to us is not JSON. It's sending back HTML, and then behind the scenes, HTMX is using JavaScript to say, okay, take that HTML and put it wherever you're targeting. So we use a target ID for wherever we want that HTML to be placed, and that's how we're updating the various parts of the page. Yes, Callie, you had your hand
That
up.
was my question. I was wondering, how are we placing them, the things that you're rendering on the page, but an ID tag?
Yeah, for sure. So
Canvas?
rather than this
Yeah.
logic right here is actually like not super important. The only thing you need to know about the routes is that they're all sending back HTML. Okay. That is like the whole point of HTMX is that now your backend is in charge of sending you the HTML. How it does that is up to the developer, but it's great because it used to be that all the backend would do was act as a JSON API and send you back JSON, and then the front end had to do all this work to figure out how to update the DOM, update the page. Now we're sending that back to the back end. We're saying you're in charge of it. And now all of a sudden, so one issue that was occurring is that a lot of companies were like, well, we're already using JavaScript on the front end. We might as well just use JavaScript on the back end. So now all of a sudden, you're no longer using things like Go or Rust, which are way faster than Node.js. Or maybe you had a preference to use something like Python, which is way slower, but has some really great added benefits. And so people are just kind of opting to use JavaScript, which is fine in a lot of cases, like we're using it here even. But now with HTMX, you're just kind of giving power back to the backend. You're saying, hey, do it however you want. Like that implementation, all I need you to do on the back end with whatever language you choose is to send me some HTML. And then on the front end, I can literally just write out a ton of HTML code and it will update everything really nicely. And so let's shift the focus over to the templates because that's really where all the HTMX stuff is happening. And that's where I think the light bulbs are going to go off when you start seeing the different attributes that are available to us. So let's look at the index. The index is going to load the new form. So let's look at that one. Let's put these side by side so we can kind of reference them back and forth. Also, is this big enough for everybody to see?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, so if you remember, the list where the to-do items are being rendered has an ID of to-dos list. So we also rendered this new form inside of this ID div, this form div with the
Oh, because they
ID
have the
form.
same ID form, they're going the same spot?
So here's the new form that gets loaded from this partial.
Yeah,
And so check this out. Normally you would say action is equal to slash to-dos, and
okay,
then you would say method is equal to
right.
post. Well, that would send the request to the post route for / to-dos, and then it would generally send back JSON. So what we're doing now is we're saying HX, so all of our attributes are going to be prefaced with HX. In fact, the full preface is data-HX. So if you're familiar with the data attributes, you know that that's a way to create custom attributes really easily in HTML. But you can make it even shorter just by doing HX. So this is HTMX / post is equal to / to-do. So this is replacing your action. This is saying, hey, when this form gets submitted, send its data to / to-dos. However, let's bring this over. When the response comes back, which is the whatever HTML gets sent back from that route, take that response and put it in the inner HTML of an element with an ID of to-dos list, which is this one right here. But we go a step further because instead of returning all the to-dos, which could take a little while, right? Like imagine we've got like I mean, you use pagination, right? So you're probably not going to have more than like 10 or 20 on a page, but still, uh, either way, what you can do is you can use this HX swap to go a step further and say, hey, swap whatever HTML comes back by putting it on the inside of the to-do list, prepend it. So if you're familiar with JavaScript and in React, I don't know how they do this, but in vanilla JavaScript and even in jQuery, you could do stuff like select an element and then you can prepend a child or you can append a child, and there's the other one where it goes right before it. I'm not sure what that one's called. So you're either putting it right inside of the element, like as the first child, or as the last child if there's existing elements, or you're putting it outside the element after or before, but outside also. And so I don't know the names for all of them. You can look it up in the docs, but they've got before begin, after begin, prepend, something. And so what this one, HX swap after begin, is saying is, hey, in this to-do list, since they're in descending order and we just created a new one, we need it to go at the top. So before the rest of them begin, inject it right there. So find
The send comment in your app.js is only talking about the existing array, not the new one that you're adding. So this is what's making the after begin is what's adding it to the top.
right. So if we go back
Not
to,
that, because I was assuming your sort function was doing that.
so if we look at the post here, it creates a new to-do. It redirects me to the show page with that to-dos ID,
Okay.
the show route. The show route sends back the to-do show template with the new to-do that it found. And so the HTML that's coming back from this to-dos request is just a single to-do. It's not the entire list. So it's not the
Okay.
ordered list. You could totally do that. Instead of saying redirect to the show page, you could either do the render directly inside the post and say just render all the to-dos inside the EJS template for the index.
Yeah.
Or you could redirect to this right here, which would do the same thing. That's fine. But the way I chose to do it is I said, hey, redirect over to the show page, which is pretty common of sending a request to a post. So typically when you send a request to post, it'll do the creation of the resource and then it'll redirect you to either an index or a show page. In this case, I went with show page because it's a familiar pattern for most beginners. And so that takes us over to the show route, which then identifies the to-do by its ID, gets the ID from the parameters in the URL. We basically just pass it in here. We say /to-dos is new to-do.id. Here we get it because of this :id pattern inside of the route. And so then we're able to access it via this rec.params.id inside of Express. And we use that to iterate over our existing to-dos and find the one whose ID matches the parameter that we passed in. And we assign that resulting object to to-do, which we then in turn render within the show template by passing it in. So if we go look at our show template, all it is a list item with the to-do text. The list item has an ID. We can't put a number as an ID, right, in HTML. So I preface it with to-do hyphen. And so to-do hyphen, the ID of the to-do item, and we're going to use that later to be able to select it when we want to delete it or edit it. And then after the text, I just include those two icons, the edit icon and the delete icon. And you'll notice, again, that, let me go ahead and close this for now, that these icons are using more HTMX. Because when you click on the edit icon, what does it do? It sends a GET request to the edit GET route, which sends you back the edit form. And guess what? We're passing in the to-do ID because we have access to it because we're inside the show page for a specific to-do. So when we send that GET request over there, it says, okay, find the to-do, inject it into the edit form, send that edit form HTML back, and this says, okay, now target the form. Well, what lives in the form currently? If we go back over here, by default, the new form lives there. But now when you click the edit button, the new form gets swapped out for the edit form. So that is this functionality here. We click on edit, here's our new form. So as soon as we click it, boom, it gets swapped out with the edit form.
All right, so the target attribute is saying where it's going,
Correct.
where you're sending that HTML.
100%. So you send the request with your HX hyphen, whatever the method is, get, post, put, patch, delete. The response is HTML, and the HX target attribute is saying whichever element with this ID that I'm passing in as the value to this HX target, that's where you're going to send it. By default, it's going to do a inner HTML swap for that element. So for example, if this is the ID of form, it's
Yeah.
going to put the new edit form HTML that comes from this. It's going to put all of this code. Of course, all these values are going to be dynamically updated, so it'll just be HTML. But it's going to put all of that inside of this div with ID of form, therefore replacing the new form code. And that's how we get that swap. Likewise, the reverse of that is that when you click the X right here, it sends a request to the /to/use/new, which sends you back the code for the new form. And we just say, hey, swap me back with the ID form again. And so it does another inner HTML swap with that new form code. And so we're just going back and forth, swap, swap, swap. And all this is happening without the need to, what's it called? That's weird. The grocery shopping one says walk the dog. I don't know what that bug is, but it's tripping me out. Something weird happened for that one. Okay, so any questions before we continue? Because this is a lot. We're drinking from the fire hose here. Let me make sure I can see people's hands.
What does your include function do again?
Yeah, good question. So just to simplify things, let me show you what it's essentially doing. So rather than just write the form like this, like, hey, this is the div ID of form, and then here is the form. I wanted to put this in its own file so that I could easily use it inside of my routes to swap it out with the edit form. So if the edit form has its own file and the new form has its own file, then I can easily just pull that file and send it back as a response, which then can be used to swap it out. And so what I did to facilitate that is I took this code, put it in a file called new-form, and this is EJS syntax. So if you just tell me which are you familiar with any backend frameworks at this point?
No, not really.
Okay, no problem. So that's helpful. So I can explain it in the context of not already knowing a specific template language. So within the context of backend frameworks, we can use template languages. All that means is that there is a specific syntax that allows us to inject data into our HTML files. So normally when you've learned HTML, you're definitely not seeing any includes, layout, anything like that. So this specific template language, EJS, is embedded JavaScript is what it means. It just allows us to embed JavaScript into HTML. So that's where the include comes from. And it allows us to embed, in this case, like a partial, or to include all this code inside the body of a layout. So a little bit confusing stuff happening there, but once you get familiar with these concepts, it'll save you a ton of not just time, but also it keeps you really organized. Because now, instead of having, like we showed a moment ago, a file with a ton of HTML inside of it, you can really keep things organized by saying, no, my new form belongs over here, really small, not a lot of code. My edit form's over here, really small. And it's kind of like the concept of keeping things modular or keeping things in components, where if you need to edit a specific thing, you can go do it within the single file where it has a single responsibility, right? So SRP, single responsibility principle. So it applies to creation of templates as well as things like functions within your code.
I
answer
never
your
just
question?
think of include as a function and just think of it like, yeah, like go back to the next. Okay, we're saying include, we're passing in what do we want to include here? We want to include the template for new form. And then that would, the like result would be all of the HTML of the new form.
Yeah, 100%. So it's just JavaScript. It's parsing this file because it's an EJS file and not an HTML file. And it says, hey, what does this layout function do? Oh, it's a function that returns the HTML from boilerplate while injecting all this code that comes after boilerplate into boilerplate. So if you look at boilerplate, it goes through and it looks for this line and it takes all of this code, sticks it right here, and then takes the entire result of that and returns it back as the response. Likewise, it goes through this code and it says, oh, there's an include here. Okay, find this code, come over here, and replace it. Simple as that. But with the added benefit of being able to pass in data. So for example, this one, you can see it's a little bit different than the new form for the to-dos list. It takes this second argument to this include function, which is an object that has to-dos inside of it. And so if we go look at the to-dos list, it then uses to-dos to iterate over them with what's called a for each loop in JavaScript. And for each to-do item in that to-dos list, or each to-do element, it's able to use yet another template. So it's just a template inside of a template being rendered into another template. Possibly a little confusing at first, especially if you're not familiar with like the clown hat syntax and all this. But if you were to get into Express and use something like EJS, there's a lot of these template languages to choose from, by the way. They're all similar in many ways. So Handlebars is one, Pug is another. I think Jade is like the original version of Pug or something like that. EJS is a good one. And if you switch between languages and frameworks, like this is JavaScript with Node, if we switched over to like Ruby on Rails, they'd have something called Embedded Ruby, ERB. Very similar syntax. So it'd be really easy to switch over to that language. This stuff is really helpful. You don't have to use these languages for the templates, but it makes it really easy to inject data into your HTML, and that's why I choose to do it. There's other ways of doing it, but this is just the way that I prefer. All right, any other questions before we move forward? Cool.
So would you be able to use it with like anything like Java in the back end? Like I know that Java has like a time leaf and it's kind of like a templating system as well.
Yes.
Um, how how would you kind of would you have a combination of like if you already have an existing server side templates and you could have this as well?
100%. So in Java, it doesn't matter. PHP, Java, Ruby, Go, Rust. You're using a backend framework. Typically, they'll use an MVC structure, but not necessarily all of them. And they'll have some form of HTML, and that'll exist within some type of HTML templates. And so then all you have to do is make sure that you include HTMX, either the CDN or directly as a local script. And then the moment you do that, you have access to this syntax right here. And so this doesn't even have to exist inside of an EJS file. If we wanted to, we can make this, we could decouple this. We could say, yeah, our backend serves HTML, but our front end file is just a pure.html file. And in fact, if you go on YouTube and you watch some HTMX tutorials, some people, when they're teaching it, will just have like a single HTML file, kind of like with React, how you have your index file and then you create your root element and then everything else lives inside of that. That's kind of the same concept. So you'd have your index.html and then you would just start swapping out different things based on the interactions from the user and let your backend handle the creation of the HTML that gets sent back. So to answer your question, if you're using Java, you could totally do that. And again, if you go to htmx.org and you click on their Discord link, there are probably a good number of people in there who are already doing that, and you could chat with them about the best way to go about it.
Super, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Alrighty, so at this point, we've kind of discussed a couple of these attributes. I think they say there's like 12 attributes. Let's jump over to the documentation a little bit, go to the docs. They have the intro, they just talk about what it is in a nutshell, and then installing, we just do it with the CDN like I just mentioned, or you just download a copy of it and then include it in a local script. Or if you are using something like npm or webpack within your I don't know that you would do it with Nest because Nest is like already coupled with React, but if you're doing it with some other npm related project like an Express application, then you could maybe Sales or something like that, but then you could use npm to install it directly as an npm package. So then you have all the documentation for the various things that are available to you. What I've shown you is just the basics. So if you think of it as HTML only gives you get and post in the form of an anchor tag for get and a form for post. And now we've generalized that to include all of our CRUD methods. So now we have access to put, patch, and delete. The sorry, late in the evening, my brain's running out of oxygen very quickly. They're going to have documentation for each one of those things. So what I've showed you is the basics. However, it goes a lot deeper. So we haven't talked a whole lot about triggers. Whenever you do an hx-post on a form, the default trigger is the submission of the form. You can change the trigger on anything to anything you want. So it could be the click of a button that submits it. It could be the mouse over a button. So any event that exists in JavaScript with JavaScript's Events API is valid to use within your hx-trigger attribute. So you can say hx trigger any event that you can think of, and it will trigger whatever the hx post get, whatever's attached to that particular element. And then what you do with the result of that, of course, you can dial it in by using things like hx target. Okay, which div are we going to put it in? Hx swap, the default is outer HTML, but maybe, or sorry, the default is inner HTML. So if you say, no, I want to swap the entire element, then you can use outer HTML. And I think there's a couple other options you'd have to go down and look. But so let's go to examples and just see a couple other cool things that they have available. And maybe this will create a couple more questions. And then we can kind of, I think we're pretty well demoing the app, but we can look through the update and delete stuff just to kind of wrap that up. But within the examples, by the way, there's a playground. I linked it on my LinkedIn a while back. I can find it and share it in like the show notes after this event. But if you look for HTMX Playground, you should find one, or maybe ask for it in the Discord. But either way, they have a playground where you can just, if you don't want to have to set anything up locally, even though it's like just a couple lines of code, you could just use the playground to go around and mess around with this stuff. But for example, let's look at a pretty cool one here. So like progress bar. This normally would require probably a fair amount of JavaScript. If we click start job, this is going to show us a project progress bar for like a job that occurs on the back end. So maybe this is, the sending of an email or something. So all of this is done with literally just 1, 2, 3, and then some CSS for the bar there. What's really cool about these examples is if you go down here and you open this up, you can see starting from the initial state of the HTML, you can walk through this for each thing that happens. So okay, this is an HX target, is set to this, and it swaps out the outer HTML. So it swaps out the entire outer HTML of this element whenever something happens. Okay, so how does it get triggered? Within this, there's a button that has an HX post for /start. Okay, so whenever that gets clicked, it does the whole thing. So then you just go through these one by one. Okay, well, when the post request to /start happens, because that's what the button triggered, then what does it do? And you can see everything from the parameters and the headers for the HTTP request to the HTML response, right? The response is always going to be HTML, and then we're going to update the page accordingly. And so then you just go to the next thing that happens. Okay, there's a get request to job progress. What does that look like? And you can see that it shows you what's happening here is it's using this style. The first part of the HTML that comes back is a width of 1%. And then if we go a little bit further to the last one here, we can see that the width, I don't know why it's 110%, but for whatever reason, it's 110%. And that just means that it's filled all the way out. And so there's some pretty cool stuff that you can do with it if you get creative that you probably wouldn't expect that you could do. And again, you don't have to write any JavaScript. Now, that's not to say that you'll never use JavaScript. Sometimes, like you'll even notice here in a moment when I go back to the code, I had to use JavaScript just to get something working really quickly without digging deeper into the documentation. Other times you may just want to use JavaScript, and that's totally okay. The point here is not to like kill JavaScript altogether. It's just to increase your productivity and your workflow and make it to where when you are writing JavaScript, you're doing it for like a very intentional, specific reason. And then on top of that, there's a ton of really cool libraries for writing JavaScript without really writing JavaScript. So you can use stuff like Alpine.js, which allows you to use more attributes on your HTML. That's kind of the trend these days with things like Tailwind and with HTMX and with Alpine. It's like just write everything as an attribute on your HTML. So don't have a separate script file for your JavaScript or anything like that. Okay, so you can go through these examples. They have some pretty cool ones. Some of the stuff we kind of did in my thing. Lazy loading is a cool one. You can see here that it's like, this is an example of a potentially data heavy computation. So just imagine that, we've got this data set coming in, and normally with React, we'd have like this giant array of objects, and each object would have a data point for each one of these things, and we would populate this table with like 3JS or something. And so that's a lot of computation that happens. And so whether that computation is happening on the back end and it's just taking a little bit of time due to increased latency, we want a way to create a better user experience. We don't want to block our user's website from loading just because we have this one big clunky element. And so the solution to that is to use this really cool concept of the HTMX indicator. So on the load of this graph, so it sends a request to HTMX get, so a get request to /graph, which sends us back this graph, and it's triggered by load. What that means is when the page first loads, go ahead and send that get request right away. And so that's really common especially if you're building everything in a separate front end application. So you've decoupled your back end from your front end, and you're writing everything in a separate HTML file. But it could also be used within the same pattern that we're using now, where we have EJS handling all of the template rendering. So in any event, it's going to fetch essentially this element, and because it takes a little while, it has this image with this class of HTMX indicator. And so when you put HTMX indicator on any element as a class nested inside of something that's sending a get, post, put, patch, delete request with HTMX, what it'll do is it'll make that one thing visible. And so you can add some additional CSS to have like a real nice animation effect. But what's happening here is this is an animated image here, and it just made that visible first with an opacity of 1. So initially it was invisible, and while we were waiting for that payload to come back, it made it visible. And so we got this nice little animation, and then the moment this actually came back and we got the full response, then it set it back to invisible. And it did all that simply by adding a single class of HTMX indicator on that animated image. And so it's some SVG file, but you could do this with like a spinning loader wheel, whatever you want, or just some text that says loading. So that's a really cool thing you can do. Again, within the examples, you can go down here and you can see, okay, this is the initial state, this is what it looks like, and then you get the graph and it sends you back, this is the image that it replaces it with, this Tokyo.png. Okay, cool. So I would definitely recommend going through the documentation. You'll absolutely have to if you're building this stuff. HTMX is super powerful. Like we've just shown, like with some really cool stuff, but there is, you can use it with WebSockets and with server sent events. So I have no experience with server sent events, but it's kind of like a quasi form of WebSockets, just not quite as robust. And you can use WebSockets with HTMX. So if any of you have familiarity with WebSockets, maybe use Socket.io or something like that, and you want to change it to where you're not writing a bunch of JavaScript code to handle all those requests, you could switch to using it with HTMX if you wanted to. Let's think about what else they have in here that's cool before we close this out. They do have built-in validation for HTML forms. So it hooks into the HTML5 validation API and integrates with it such that if you submit something that's required and they haven't filled that out, whatever, it's going to do all of your validations for you. So that's pretty cool. And you can see how you can actually augment it further to do things like an on key up, and you can get into this object for the specific form, and you can set the custom validity, am I saying that right? Validity to an empty string and so on. So if you're familiar with doing validation in that way, then this might be familiar to you and you can use that as needed. Okay, so wrapping up, I'm just going to show two more things real quick, and let's do a quick overview. How about that? So if we walk through kind of the flow of everything, this is our main page. So when the website loads, this is what we're seeing. Now this is the index, but it also has a form partial, the new form, new to do form, and it has the list. So these are two partials that get rendered within it, and this is the result. Now, if we type something, we're doing that within the new form. And so that happens inside of this input here. And then when we click on the add to do button, it's going to trigger this HX post to /todos. It'll send this request body, which will then get processed by our backend, which will then send back the single list item for the newly created to do. And what it does is if we go back to, sorry, it's in the same file. With the HX swap, it does an after begin on the to-do list. The to-do list lives over in our index right here. And so it just places it on the inside of this unordered list at the top. So then if we want to edit it, anytime we click on the edit icon, so the edit icon lives inside of the show over here. So this is our show for each individual to-do item that gets created, and it sends back the to-do text. It also makes sure that that list item has an ID of the specific ID for this to-do item so that we can select it later. And likewise, it has two icons, the pencil icon for editing and then the trash can icon for deleting. The pencil icon sends a GET request to the edit with the ID, so the edit route for to-dos with the ID, such that we can send back the edit form to swap with the existing new form and pre-populate it with the text for that specific ID or that to-do with that ID. So its target again is the form again lives over here. So it starts out with a new form, and then we submit a to-do item with the new form. It prepends it to this unordered list. We click on the edit link from that list item, and it swaps out the new form with the edit form. So then if we go to the edit form has a button at the very top so that if we close it, it sends a GET request back to to-dos new, which actually should be /todos, but it still worked apparently. And it again targets the form that held the original new form, is now holding the edit form, and is going to swap the edit form with the new form. So it's just that back and forth between those two forms. And the only thing that I have here that is actual vanilla JavaScript, because I didn't have time to do it in HTMX without digging further into the documentation, was I am selecting this form and I'm listening for a submit of the edit form. When the edit form is submitted, I'm manually clicking or automatically clicking the close edit form button with JavaScript, and because it gets clicked and because the default trigger for the GET request is a click, it's going to send that request for new and do the swap. So two things are happening. The form gets submitted, which updates the existing to-do item inside the list, and also the close button gets clicked, which swaps out the new form. And so that's why when we go to edit something, we can either just click on cancel and it'll swap it back to the new, or if we click on update to do, it will do the triggering of this submission of this edit form, which will then update down here. Simultaneously, that JavaScript will click this button, which will swap this out with the original new form. So we get the new form and this gets updated here. Yes, Callie.
Could we add the HX get, like those attributes to the button on line 7 and it would do the same thing?
On line 7. Yes, you're probably right. So that's actually the solution that I'm 99% sure that would work. So when you click this, it's triggering a submit. But what Callie's saying is, why don't we also just take this logic here and do an HX get, right? Because when we click this, it's sending this. So essentially the same thing, right? Make this an HX get, to-dos new. So two things are going to happen. When this form is submitted with this button, it's going to send the put, which is going to target the specific to-do item in the list and swap out its outer HTML, and that's all good. But potentially the clicking of this button, because two events are going to happen, right? A submit and a click, would also, because this is an HX get, could send an additional request. So it's like 2 requests happening. And so we'd have to test that. We can't do it now, obviously, but there's something called synchronization within
Okay.
the documentation where if you are triggering multiple requests, you want to make sure and synchronize those so that you don't have any side effects that are unintentional.
Okay, yeah, interesting. You got me hooked and I was not expecting to want to
Yeah.
do this, but now I'm like, what can I build?
Yeah, your brain is like, huh. So I know we're going over on time here. I want to respect everybody's time. So we'll close it down here. My closing uh, thoughts are I've only used HTMX in one real world application. I built a timer application, real time timers for a paintball field where everybody looks at their phone and they go, okay, my party with these 25 people are on this field and yours is queued up and we have 15 minutes left and you can watch it count down and you can see which field we're on and blah, 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 blah. And I did all of that with Node.js Express and WebSockets. And it's a lot of vanilla JavaScript. And I was just like, man, once I learned HTMX, I was like, I'm swapping out all this stuff. And I went in and did it, and I just got rid of like tons and tons of vanilla JavaScript. It was like, oh, you don't need that anymore. You need like literally just like HX get or HX post or HX whatever. Decide where it goes when it swaps. You just change your backend just a little bit. You're like, okay, I'm no longer sending JSON. Now I'm actually going to, or I'm no longer rendering HTML in the traditional monolithic way. Now I'm actually rendering specific partials that are going to update on the various parts of the page to these different targeted areas. So yeah, that's HTMX in a nutshell. I think it's pretty cool, pretty neat. I'm always looking for technologies that make web development and programming fun, right? That's not to say that the traditional way of, or like the modern, hip, whatever ways aren't fun. But when you've been doing it for a really long time, sometimes the thought of like setting up an entire new React application with Vite and hooking it into a backend and serving JSON just for something simple. You're just like, you have this idea and you're like, that'd be really cool if I could build that, and then you're like, oh, but I have all this work I'd have to do. Now it's like I could probably build that in a weekend. And so tools like this, like Alpine.js, like HTMX, like Hypermedia, Hyperview is one that you can use for mobile development. They just make it so easy. Tailwind for styling, all that stuff. You can just like build out SaaS ideas really quickly and get your get your POCs and proof of concept or spikes, things like that done really quickly. So thank you everyone for your time. Really glad to have been invited to be here and share this with you all. So appreciate you. You can find me on LinkedIn, Ian Schoonover. And from there, if you're interested, you can find more about like the developer community that we have over on Discord and stuff like that. But thank you, Callie, and thank you everybody for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Yay, this was
Thank
so
you.
fun.
Yeah, thank
Yeah,
you.
it was
It's
fun.
great. A lot of good information.
Thank you.
So cool. All right, guys, we will end it here. I will get the video posted sometime tomorrow. And yeah, thank you, Ian, so much. This was so great. And keep working on your to-do list. Maybe use HTMX to make them. All right. Bye, guys.
Bye. Thanks everyone.
Guys, have a good night.